The desert sun beat down on Clara Boone's homestead, a merciless hammer forging the earth into cracked, barren clay. It was 1,880, and the valley, once green with promise, was now a graveyard of wilted crops and broken dreams. Clara stood at the edge of her field, her hands calloused from years of toil, her auburn hair tied back beneath a faded bonnet. At 32, she was a widow, her heart scarred by the loss of her husband, Samuel, gunned down by bandits 2 years prior. The homestead was all she had left: a sagging cabin, a dry well, and a pantry with one last loaf of bread, baked from the final scraps of flour. Clara's eyes, green as the fields she'd once tended, scanned the horizon. The drought had come like a thief, stealing the life from her land. Her stomach growled, a reminder of the hunger that gnawed at her daily. She could ration the bread for another day, maybe 2. But then what? The town of Dust Creek was a day's ride, and her horse, Sage, was too weak to make the journey without rest. She was alone, save for the memories of Samuel's laughter and the weight of his absence. A faint dust cloud rose in the distance, stirring her from her thoughts. Clara's hand went to the rifle leaning against the porch, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her chest. Strangers in this valley were rarely friends. Bandits roamed freely, and Amos Creed, the land baron who ruled Dust Creek, sent his men to harass homesteaders into selling their land. She squinted, shielding her eyes, as 3 figures emerged from the haze: a tall man in a tattered preacher's coat, a woman with a wary gait, and a small girl clutching a rag doll. Clara lowered the rifle but kept it close as they approached. The man, his face lined with sorrow, tipped a worn hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep and weathered. "Name's Ezekiel. This is Lila and Tess. We mean no harm, just seeking shelter from the heat." Lila, the woman, stood tall, her dark skin glistening with sweat, her eyes sharp with caution. Tess, no older than 10, clung to Lila's hand, her blonde hair matted with dust. Clara's heart softened at the sight of the girl, but suspicion lingered. "Where you headed?" she asked, her voice firm. "Away from trouble," Ezekiel said. "Creed's men are after us. We crossed him, and he don't forgive." Clara's jaw tightened at Creed's name. She'd heard of his greed, his hired guns driving families from their land to expand his empire. "You got no food, no water," she said, noting their cracked lips and hollow cheeks. "How'd you make it this far?" "Faith," Ezekiel said with a faint smile. "And stubbornness." Lila spoke, her voice low but steady. "We ain't here to take, ma'am. Just need a place to rest, and filing manner than party presses." Clara studied them, her hunger warring with her heart. The bread in her pantry was her last, a lifeline against starvation, but Tess's wide, frightened eyes reminded her of the child she and Samuel had never had. She sighed, setting the rifle down. "Come inside," she said. "Ain't much, but you're welcome to it." The cabin was sparse, its walls worn by wind and time. Clara set the loaf on the table, its crust cracked but warm from the morning's baking. She sliced it into 4 uneven pieces, her hands trembling as she pushed the plate toward the strangers. "Eat," she said, ignoring the pang in her stomach. "It's all I got." Ezekiel hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "This is your last, ain't it?" "Don't matter," Clara said, her voice sharp to hide her fear. "No one starves under my roof." Tess reached for a piece, her small hands trembling, and Lila followed, her gratitude silent but clear. Ezekiel bowed his head, murmuring a prayer before breaking the bread. They ate slowly, savoring each bite, and Clara felt a warmth she hadn't known since Samuel's death. The act of giving, small as it was, felt like defiance against the desert's cruelty. As dusk fell, the strangers shared their story. Ezekiel, once a preacher, had spoken out against Creed's tyranny in Dust Creek. Lila, a runaway slave, had escaped Creed's ranch, where she'd been forced to work. Tess, an orphan, had been taken in by Lila after her parents died in a raid. They were bound by loss, running from Creed's wrath, but Clara's kindness had given them a moment of peace. "We'll repay you," Ezekiel said, his voice earnest. "You've given us more than bread." Clara waved him off, her heart heavy but resolute. "Just survive," she said. "That's payment enough." But as they settled for the night, a distant rumble broke the silence. Hoofbeats, heavy and purposeful. Clara grabbed her rifle, peering through the window. Shadows moved in the twilight, Men on horseback, their spurs glinting. Creed's men. Her heart raced, the bread now a distant memory. The desert had taken much, but it wouldn't take her home, not yet. The dawn broke over Clara Boone's homestead, a pale light that did little to warm the parched earth. The valley lay silent, its once lush fields now a patchwork of cracked soil and withered stalks, victims of a drought that showed no mercy. Clara stood on her porch, her hands gripping the railing, her green eyes tracing the horizon where the sun rose like a warning. The loaf of bread she'd shared with the strangers Ezekiel, Lila, and Tess was gone, and with it, her last defense against hunger. Her pantry was bare, her well dry, and her horse, Sage, stood listless in the corral, too weak to bear a rider. Yet, the act of giving had kindled a spark in Clara's heart, a flicker of defiance against the despair that had shadowed her since Samuel's death. Inside the cabin the strangers stirred, their presence both a comfort and a burden. Ezekiel, the former preacher, knelt by the hearth, coaxing a small fire to life. Lila, the runaway, sat sharpening a knife, her movements precise despite the weariness in her eyes. Tess, the orphan girl, clutched her rag doll, humming softly as she watched Clara. The hoofbeats from the night before, the threat of Amos Creed's men, hung over them like a storm cloud. Clara had sent the strangers to hide in the root cellar when the riders passed, but she knew they'd return. Creed wanted her land, and he'd stop at nothing to claim it. "We can't stay," Clara said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "The drought's killed my crops and Creed's men'll be back. Dust Creek's our only chance. There's a storehouse there. Maybe some work." Ezekiel looked up, his face lined with the weight of years spent preaching to a world that didn't listen. "Dust Creek's under Creed's thumb," he said. "He's bought up the water rights, controls the wells. Folks are starvin' while he hoards." Lila's knife paused, her dark eyes meeting Clara's. "Die. He did the same on his ranch. Took the water, left us to die. You gave us your bread, Clara. We ain't leaving you to face this alone." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to send them away, to keep her solitude intact. But Tess's small hand tugged at her skirt, her blue eyes wide with trust. "You're kind," Tess said softly. "Like my ma was." The words pierced Clara, stirring memories of Samuel's warmth, his dreams of a family they'd never had. She knelt, brushing a strand of hair from Tess's face. "All right," she said. "We'll go together, but we move fast." The day was spent preparing. Ezekiel repaired the wagon's axle, his hands steady despite his hunger. Lila taught Clara how to trap small game. Though the desert offered little, a scrawny jackrabbit was all they caught, its meat barely enough for a thin stew. Tess gathered what little they had, a half-empty canteen, a worn blanket, and Clara's rifle. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash, Clara surveyed her homestead, the cabin, the corral, the barren fields. They were all she'd fought for since Samuel's death. Leaving felt like betrayal, but staying meant starvation. They set out at dusk, the wagon creaking under their weight, Sage pulling with what strength she had left. The trail to Dust Creek wound through a desolate landscape, the ground cracked like old leather, the air thick with dust. Clara drove the wagon, her rifle across her lap, while Ezekiel rode Sage, his eyes scanning the horizon. Lila walked beside Tess, her knife tucked into her belt, her posture alert. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the groan of the wheels and the distant howl of a coyote. As night fell, they camped in a shallow gulch, the stars cold and distant above. Ezekiel shared stories of his days as a preacher, his voice low and soothing. "I lost my flock to greed," he said. "Creed's men burned my church when I spoke against him. But your kindness, Clara, it's a sermon in itself." Clara stared into the fire, her hands clasped tight. "Kindness don't fill bellies," she said. "I gave you my last, and now we're all starvin'." Lila's voice cut through the dark. "You gave us hope. That's more than Creed ever did." Tess curled against Clara, her doll clutched tight. "Will we find food in Dust Creek?" she asked, her voice small. Clara forced a smile, though her heart ached. "We'll find something, sweetheart, I promise." But the promise felt hollow. Dust Creek was a day away, and Creed's grip on the town was ironclad. Ezekiel had heard rumors in his travels. Creed was buying up water rights, diverting streams to his ranch, leaving homesteaders and townsfolk to wither. Clara's well had been her lifeline, but 2 days ago Creed's men had sabotaged it, filling it with stones. The memory fueled her anger, a fire that kept her moving. At dawn they reached a rise overlooking Dust Creek. Its wooden buildings huddled against the desert's edge. Smoke rose from the saloon, and a crowd gathered near the storehouse, their voices sharp with desperation. Clara's heart sank. Famine had already taken hold. She urged Sage forward, but a gunshot cracked through the air, halting the wagon. 3 riders emerged from a copse of scrub, their faces masked by bandanas, their rifles glinting. "Creed's men, Clara Boone," the leader called, his voice muffled but menacing. "Your land's ours now. Turn back, or you're dead." Clara gripped her rifle, her pulse racing. Ezekiel raised his hands, urging calm, but Lila's knife was already drawn, her stance protective of Tess. "We ain't turning back," Clara said, her voice steady. "You want my land? Come take it." The riders laughed, but before they could act, Lila hurled a rock, striking one in the chest. The distraction was enough. Clara fired, her bullet grazing the leader's arm. He cursed, retreating with his men into the dust, but their threat lingered. Clara's hands shook as she lowered the rifle, her resolve hardening. Creed wouldn't stop, not until he owned the valley. "We keep moving," she said, her voice firm. "Dust Creek's got answers. We'll find 'em." Ezekiel nodded, his eyes grave. "Creed's planning something big. I heard talk of a raid on the storehouse. If he burns it, the town starves." Clara's jaw tightened. The storehouse was Dust Creek's last hope, and hers. She looked at Lila, Tess, and Ezekiel, their faces etched with hunger but lit with determination. Her bread had bound them, and now they'd fight together. As they descended toward the town, Clara felt a shadow growing, not just of famine, but of Creed's greed. The desert tested them, but so did their hearts. And Clara knew the fight was only beginning. The desert stretched before Clara Boone like a furnace, its heat a relentless fist that pounded the earth into submission. The wagon creaked under the weight of their meager supplies, its wheels grinding through sand as Sage, Clara's weary horse, pulled with fading strength. The sun blazed overhead, a merciless orb that turned the air to shimmering waves, blurring the horizon. Where Dust Creek lay, a distant promise of salvation or ruin. Clara gripped the reins, her hands rough from years of toil, her green eyes squinting against the glare. Beside her, Tess, the orphan girl, clutched her rag doll, her small frame hunched against the jolting wagon. Ezekiel, the former preacher, rode Sage's flank, his tattered coat flapping like a broken wing. Lila, the runaway, walked ahead, her knife gleaming at her belt, her steps steady despite the hunger etched into her face. The encounter with Amos Creed's men had left a scar on Clara's resolve, their threat echoing in her mind. "Your land's ours now." She'd fired on them, driven them off, but she knew they'd return, their greed as unyielding as the drought that choked the valley. Dust Creek was their only hope, a town where the storehouse held the last of the valley's grain, where answers to Creed's tyranny might lie. But the road was a gauntlet, and the desert was no kinder than the men who hunted them. The trail wound through a maze of dunes and rocky outcrops, the ground littered with bleached bones and brittle scrub. Clara's canteen was nearly empty, its last drops warm and gritty. She glanced at Tess, whose lips were cracked, her eyes wide with a quiet fear. "We'll make it, sweetheart," Clara said, forcing a smile. "Dust Creek's close." Tess nodded, but her grip on the doll tightened. Ezekiel's voice broke the silence, low and steady. "Faith will carry us, Clara. You gave us your bread." Clara's jaw tightened. "Faith don't fill bellies, Ezekiel, nor does it stop bullets." Lila turned, her dark eyes sharp. "Then we fight, like you did yesterday. You're stronger than you know." Clara wanted to believe her, but the weight of Samuel's death, the barren homestead, and the hunger gnawing at her gut made strength feel like a distant dream. She thought of the loaf she'd shared, the act that had bound these strangers to her. It was a small thing, but it had sparked something, a flicker of hope she couldn't name. By noon, the heat was unbearable, the air thick with dust that stung their eyes and throats. Sage stumbled, her hooves sinking into a soft dune, and Clara leapt down to ease her burden. The wagon was light, carrying only a blanket, a half-empty canteen, and Clara's rifle, but it was still too much for the weakened horse. Ezekiel dismounted, helping Clara push the wagon free, his breath ragged. Lila scouted ahead, her knife ready, while Tess clung to the wagon's edge, her small voice humming a tune that felt like a prayer. They found shade beneath a rocky overhang, A brief respite from the sun's wrath. Lila shared the last of the jackrabbit stew, its thin broth barely enough to wet their lips. "We're low on water," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "There's a creek bed a mile west, but it's likely dry." Clara nodded, her mind racing. "We'll check it. If it's dry, we push on." "No choice." Ezekiel's eyes softened. "You remind me of my sister," he said. "She gave her last to others too. Died in a raid. But her heart was bigger than this desert." Clara looked away, the weight of his words too close to her own grief. Samuel had been her anchor, his dreams of a thriving homestead, the fire that kept her going. Now, with the land dying and Creed's men circling, she felt adrift. But Tess's hand found hers, small and warm, and Clara squeezed it, drawing strength from the girl's trust. The creek bed was dry, its banks cracked like old parchment. Clara knelt, digging with her hands, hoping for a trickle, but found only dust. Lila's face was grim as she scanned the horizon. "We're not alone," she said, pointing to fresh hoofprints in the sand. "Creed's men, they're tracking us." Clara's heart raced, her rifle a cold comfort in her hands. "How many?" "3, maybe 4, Lila said. "We can't outrun 'em. Not with sage like this." Ezekiel stood, his preacher's coat stained with sweat. "Then we face 'em, like David and Goliath." Clara's lips twitched, a spark of defiance igniting. "Ain't no giants here, just cowards with guns. We make a stand." They fortified the creek bed, using the wagon as cover and piling rocks to form a barrier. Tess hid behind the wagon, her doll clutched tight, while Lila and Ezekiel took positions at Clara's side. The hoofbeats grew louder, a drumbeat of danger, and 4 riders appeared, their bandanas pulled high, their rifles glinting. The leader, a scar-faced man with cold eyes, reined in his horse. "Clara Boone," he snarled. "Creed's done waitin'. Hand over your deed, or we bury you here." Clara's grip on her rifle tightened, her voice steady. "You'll bury nothing but your own. Get off my trail." The leader laughed, raising his rifle, but Lila moved first, her knife flashing as she hurled it, catching one rider in the shoulder. He screamed, dropping his gun, and Clara fired, her bullet striking another's leg. Ezekiel charged, wielding a rock like a club, but a gunshot rang out, and he fell, blood seeping from his side. Clara's heart lurched, but she fired again, dropping the 3rd rider. The leader retreated, cursing, as Lila dragged Ezekiel behind the wagon. "He's alive," Lila said, pressing her shawl to his wound. "But he's bad." Clara's hands shook, but she reloaded her rifle, her eyes scanning the horizon for more riders. Tess's sobs cut through the chaos, and Clara knelt beside her. "Stay strong, Tess. We're getting through this." Ezekiel groaned, his face pale. "You're a fighter, Clara. Like her, like my sister." Clara's throat tightened, but she focused on the task. She tore her sleeve, binding Ezekiel's wound as Lila kept watch. The riders were gone, but their threat lingered, and Dust Creek was still hours away. As they lifted Ezekiel into the wagon, Lila's sharp eyes caught a glint in the distance. A fire, small but deliberate, near the town. "Creed's men," she said. "They're planning to burn the storehouse." Clara's blood ran cold. The storehouse was Dust Creek's lifeline, the last bastion against famine. If it fell, the town would starve, and her hopes with it. She looked at her companions, Ezekiel, bleeding but unbowed. Lila, fierce and resolute. Tess, small but brave. The bread she'd shared had bound them, and now they'd fight as one. "We move now," Clara said, her voice ablaze. "We stop Creed or we lose everything." They pushed on, the wagon creaking, Sage staggering but determined. The desert tested them, its heat and hunger a crucible, but Clara felt a fire within her, a fire born of the loaf she'd given, of the trust she'd earned. Dust Creek loomed ahead, its fate tied to theirs, and Clara knew the road would demand more than courage. It would demand her heart. The dusk sky over Dust Creek burned with the colors of a dying fire, streaks of orange and purple bleeding into the darkening horizon. Clara Boone drove the wagon hard, its wheels rattling over the rocky trail, her heart pounding in rhythm with Sage's labored hoofbeats. Ezekiel lay in the wagon bed, his side bandaged but still seeping blood, his breath shallow but stubborn. Lila walked beside, her knife at the ready, her dark eyes scanning the shadows for Creed's men. Tess clung to Clara's side, her rag doll a small anchor against the fear in her wide blue eyes. The faint glow of fire on the horizon confirmed Lila's warning. Amos Creed's men were attacking the storehouse, Dust Creek's last defense against famine. Clara's grip on the reins tightened, her resolve a blade forged in hunger and loss. The town came into view, its wooden buildings hunched against the desert wind. Shouts and gunfire echoed from the center, where the storehouse stood, its timber walls already licked by flames. Townsfolk ran in panic, some wielding pitchforks, others fleeing with what little they could carry. Clara's stomach twisted. The storehouse held the valley's last grain, the only thing standing between Dust Creek and starvation. She halted the wagon at the edge of town, her rifle in hand, her green eyes blazing with determination. "Lila, get Ezekiel to the dock," Clara said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Tess, stay with him. I'm going to the storehouse." Lila's face hardened. "You ain't going alone, Clara. We're in this together." Ezekiel stirred, his voice weak but fierce. "Go, Clara. Save the town. Like you saved us." Tess's small hand gripped Clara's. Be careful," she whispered, her voice trembling. Clara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She handed Tess the reins and leapt from the wagon, Lila at her side. The streets were a blur of smoke and panic, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning wood. Clara ran toward the storehouse, her rifle raised, Lila's knife glinting in the firelight. A crowd of townsfolk gathered near the flames, their faces etched with desperation as they tried to douse the fire with buckets of scarce water. "Clara Boone," a voice bellowed, cutting through the din. Amos Creed stood atop a wagon, his broad frame silhouetted against the burning storehouse. His gray hair gleamed under his hat, his eyes cold as steel. 4 of his men flanked him, their rifles trained on the crowd. "You should have sold when I asked," he sneered. "Now you'll starve with the rest." Clara's blood boiled, her husband's face flashing in her mind. Samuel, gunned down by bandits she now knew worked for Creed. "You're a thief and a murderer," she shouted, her rifle aimed at his chest. "This ends tonight." The townsfolk turned, their fear giving way to murmurs of defiance. Creed laughed, a sound like gravel underfoot. "You're outnumbered, widow. Drop the gun, or we burn more than grain." Before Clara could respond, Lila moved, her knife flashing as she tackled one of Creed's men, disarming him in a blur. The crowd surged, emboldened by her courage, and Clara fired, her bullet grazing another gunman's arm. Chaos erupted, townsfolk fought with whatever they had, shovels and fists against rifles. Clara and Lila dove behind a barrel, bullets splintering the wood above them. The storehouse flames roared higher, threatening to consume everything. "We gotta put out that fire," Clara said, her voice urgent. "Or we all starve." Lila nodded, her eyes fierce. "I'll get to the well. You keep 'em busy." Clara covered Lila as she sprinted toward the town's well, dodging gunfire. The townsfolk rallied, their anger outweighing their fear. But Creed's men were relentless, their bullets cutting through the crowd. Clara's heart raced, her hand steady as she fired, dropping another gunman. She saw Lila reach the well, rallying a group to form a bucket line, but the flames were spreading too fast. A shout drew Clara's attention. Creed, now on horseback, charging toward the storehouse with a torch. "If I can't have the valley, no one will," he roared, hurling the torch through a broken window. The flames surged, a wall of heat blasting Clara's face. She ran toward him, her rifle raised, but a gunman tackled her, pinning her to the ground. His breath was hot, his grip bruising, but Clara drove her knee into his gut, rolling free and scrambling to her feet. Creed reined in his horse, his eyes locking on hers. "You're as stubborn as Samuel was," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "He begged for his life before my men shot him. All for that worthless patch of dirt you call home." The words hit like a bullet, tearing through Clara's heart. Samuel's death. The bandits she'd always suspected Creed's hand, but the truth was a blade. Rage surged, her vision narrowing to Creed's smug face. She raised her rifle, her finger on the trigger, ready to end him. But Tess's voice echoed in her mind, "Be careful," and the memory of the loaf she'd shared, the bond it forged, steadied her hand. "You don't get to take my soul," Clara said, her voice low but fierce. She lowered the rifle, firing at Creed's horse instead, sending it rearing. Creed fell, cursing, and Clara tackled him, binding his hands with a rope from the ground. "You'll face a judge," she said. "Not my bullet." The townsfolk cheered, their courage swelling as they overpowered the remaining gunmen. Lila's bucket line fought the flames, But the storehouse was lost, its roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. Clara's heart sank, the grain was gone, and famine loomed closer. But as she dragged Creed to the sheriff's office, she saw Ezekiel and Tess in the crowd. Ezekiel leaning on a crutch, Tess holding his hand. They'd survived, and so had the town's spirit. Lila approached, her face streaked with soot. "We saved what we could," she said, pointing to a small pile of salvaged grain sacks. "It ain't much, but it's a start." Clara nodded, her chest tight with grief and hope. Creed's men were bound, his plans in ruins, but the cost was heavy. The storehouse was ash, and Dust Creek faced starvation. Yet, as she looked at the townsfolk, their faces lit by the dying fire, she saw something new: unity, forged in the heat of defiance. The loaf she'd shared had sparked more than survival. It had kindled a community. The fight wasn't over, but Clara knew they'd face it together. The dawn broke over Dust Creek, a pale gold light that did little to soften the scars of the night before. The storehouse was a smoldering ruin, its charred beams jutting like broken bones against the desert sky. Clara Boone stood in the town square, her hands still trembling from the weight of her rifle, now slung across her back. Her auburn hair hung loose, streaked with soot, her green eyes reflecting the devastation and the faint flicker of hope that refused to die. The townsfolk gathered around the wreckage, their faces hollow with hunger and grief, yet their shoulders squared with a newfound resolve. Amos Creed was behind bars, his reign of greed ended, but the loss of the grain meant famine loomed like a vulture over the valley. Clara's heart ached as she surveyed the crowd. Ezekiel, the former preacher, leaned on a crutch, his side bandaged but his eyes bright with faith. Lila, the runaway, stood tall, her knife now sheathed, her presence a quiet strength. Tess, the orphan girl, clutched her rag doll, her small frame pressed close to Clara, seeking comfort. The battle had united them, but the cost was steep. Clara thought of the loaf she'd shared, a simple act that had sparked this bond, and wondered if it could carry them through the hunger ahead. "We've got nothing left," a grizzled farmer muttered, kicking at the ashes. "Creed's gone, but so's the grain. We'll starve before winter." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, fear threatening to unravel their fragile unity. Clara's stomach twisted, she felt the weight of their despair, the echo of her own when Samuel died. But Lila stepped forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "We ain't done yet," she said. "Clara gave us her last bread when she had nothing. We can do the same, share what we got, fight for each other." The townsfolk fell silent, their eyes turning to Clara. She shifted, uneasy under their gaze. "I ain't no leader," she said, her voice rough. "I just did what was right." Ezekiel's deep voice rose, steady despite his pain. "And that's why we're listening, Clara. You showed us what it means to give when it hurts. We can do the same." A woman stepped forward, her apron stained with dust. "I've got a sack of cornmeal hidden in my cellar," she said. "It ain't much, but I'll share it." Another man, a blacksmith, nodded. "Got some dried beans stashed away. Enough for a few meals." One by one, the townsfolk spoke, offering what little they had: potatoes, jerky, a jar of preserves. Clara's throat tightened, the memory of her loaf mirrored in their generosity. She looked at Lila, whose eyes gleamed with pride, and Tess, who smiled for the first time since the fire. Ezekiel raised his crutch, his voice ringing like a sermon. "This is our strength. Together we rise from ashes." The crowd set to work, pooling their meager stores in the town square. Clara organized the effort, her hands steady as she sorted sacks and jars, her heart lighter with each contribution. Lila and Tess carried water from the well, now free from Creed's control, while Ezekiel spoke words of hope, his preacher's fire rekindled. By midday, the square was alive with activity: women boiling broth, men repairing wagons, children gathering wood. Dust Creek, battered but unbowed, was reborn in the act of sharing. Clara returned to her homestead that afternoon, the wagon laden with a small share of the town's supplies. Sage, strengthened by a borrowed feed sack, pulled with renewed vigor. Ezekiel, Lila, and Tess rode with her, their bond forged in fire and hunger. The homestead was as barren as she'd left it. The fields cracked. The well, still choked with stones. But Clara saw it with new eyes, not as a grave for her dreams, but as a canvas for renewal. "We'll fix the well," Lila said, her voice firm. "I know how to dig. We'll find water." Ezekiel nodded, leaning on his crutch. And I'll help rebuild. This place'll grow again, Clara. Tess tugged at Clara's hand, her rag doll tucked under her arm. Can I stay with you? She asked, her voice small but hopeful. Like family, Clara knelt, her heart swelling. She thought of Samuel, of the child they'd never had, and saw Tess's face, bright with trust. You're already family, she said, pulling the girl into a hug. All of you are. The next days were a blur of labor. Lila led the effort to clear the well, her strength and skill unearthing a faint trickle of water that grew stronger with each passing hour. Ezekiel, though weakened, carved new fence posts, his hands steady with purpose. Tess tended the horses, her laughter a melody that softened the desert's harsh edges. The townsfolk came too, bringing tools and seeds, their gratitude a silent echo of Clara's loaf. The homestead began to heal, its fields prepared for planting, its well a lifeline once more. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Clara stood in her cabin, kneading dough. The flour was a gift from the town, the water from her restored well. She baked a new loaf, its crust golden, its scent a promise of life. She carried it to Dust Creek, where the townsfolk gathered, their faces no longer shadowed by fear. Ezekiel, now stronger, said a prayer, his voice warm with faith. Lila sliced the bread, sharing it with the crowd, her smile fierce and proud. Tess handed a piece to Clara, her eyes shining. This is for you, Tess said. Like you gave to us. Clara took the bread, its warmth a mirror of the hope in her heart. She thought of Samuel, his love woven into the land she'd fought for. The famine still loomed, but Dust Creek was no longer alone. The loaf she'd shared had sparked a chain of generosity, a community bound by sacrifice. Lila had found freedom, her past as a runaway fading in the light of new purpose. Ezekiel had reclaimed his calling, his words a beacon for the town. Tess had a home, her laughter a gift to them all. As night fell, Clara stood by her homestead, the new barn half-built, its frame a symbol of what could rise from ruin. The stars glittered above, their light a reminder of the hope that had carried her through. She thought of the loaf, the strangers, the fight against creed. The desert had tested her, taken much, but it had given her something greater. A family forged in hardship, a future born from ashes. Clara broke the bread, sharing it with Ezekiel, Lila, and Tess under the desert sky. The valley was still harsh, its challenges far from over, but Clara Boone was no longer a widow alone. She was part of Dust Creek, part of a people who'd learned that a single act of kindness could feed a town, and in that truth, she found peace.